I have been a comms officer for 11 years, and I have made exactly one mistake that changed the course of my life. I am not certain it was a mistake. I have been trying to decide for 2 years, and I have not finished deciding yet. Let me tell you what happened. The Durable Margin was not a warship. She was not a patrol corvette or a diplomatic envoy or anything that suggested force or preparedness. She was a mid-range cargo hauler, registered to the Vethrani Free Passage Consortium, 219 metric tons unladen, with a hull that had been repaired so many times in so many ports that her plating was a study in the variety of alloys available across 8 sectors. She carried food supplements, medical-grade polymer feedstock, and 11,000 units of pre-assembled atmospheric filtration housing bound for a resettlement colony on the far edge of the Veth corridor. She had a crew of 7, a drive configuration that the manufacturers had discontinued support for 4 years prior, and a comms suite that was, in my professional assessment, exactly good enough. I was her comms officer. That was my designation. It was also, in practical terms, my entire identity aboard that ship. The captain, Orveth Dennick, was a practical woman of few words and precise habits, who trusted me to manage all external communication, all distress frequency monitoring, and all the procedural filings that accompanied transit through contested corridor space. She gave me latitude. I tried not to abuse it. Our working relationship had settled, over 3 years, into the kind of functional trust that doesn't need to be spoken about, because speaking about it would change its nature. She told me what she needed. Deuced it. We did not have discussions about mutual confidence. We simply got on with things. The contested corridor space is the relevant detail. It is always the detail that matters, in any account of what happened. The Veth Outer Passage runs between Sector 14 of the Vethrani, the administrative zone, and a region that has been claimed by Pronolence various points in the past 60 years by 4 different entities. The Vethrani Zone itself, the Sereth Sovereignty, a coalition of independent station operators, and a Terran Commonwealth surveying consortium that planted marker buoys along the outer edge in year 1278, and then forgot, institutionally speaking, that it had done so. The buoys are still there. The Terran Survey Consortium became part of a larger administrative body, which became part of another, and the buoys were simply decommissioned, because nobody had a clear record of who owned them or what they were doing. This is a common problem in contested corridor space. Records accumulate, then drift, then become someone else's problem. The someone else shifts over time, and the problem shifts with them. And eventually it ends up in a resolution office somewhere with a very long queue and a very short budget and no particular urgency. Because the thing that makes a problem like this hard to resolve is that it isn't causing active harm. It's just sitting there in 2 separate databases waiting. The practical consequence in year 1289 was that the Outer Veth corridor had 2 overlapping emergency frequency allocations. Sector 14's emergency channel, the one used by Vethrani shipping, by Vethrani patrol craft, by anyone who needed urgent assistance in that part of space, was also, by accident of administrative history, registered in the Terran Commonwealth's patrol grid frequency table as an active monitoring frequency for the Outer Veth survey zone. 2 grids, 1 frequency. The overlap had existed for 11 years. Nobody had resolved it because it required both parties to simultaneously acknowledge the other's presence in a space neither had formally conceded, and that kind of acknowledgement has diplomatic implications that neither party's administrators had been prepared to engage with. So the overlap simply persisted, documented in 2 separate bureaucratic systems, unresolved by either, invisible to anyone who only had access to one. I had access to one. The drive coil cascade began at 4:03 hours, ship time, 6 days out from the last relay waypoint and 4 days short of our next scheduled stop. I was on watch. I was not asleep, which I mention only because I have been asked whether I was asleep, more than once, by people who seemed to believe that the subsequent events would be more explicable if I had been. I was not. I was reviewing cargo manifest discrepancies, which is the kind of work you do on a quiet watch, when there is nothing else demanding your attention, and I was drinking a compound that the ship's provisions officer called tea and that I had never independently confirmed was related to any recognized beverage. The manifest discrepancy in question was a count variance on a pallet of filtration seals, 14 units short, against a load record that showed them present. It was the kind of small error that is usually attributable to a scan error at loading, which is what I thought it was, and which is what it turned out to be, eventually, after none of that mattered anymore. The drive coils gave me approximately 40 seconds of warning before they failed. This is more warning than they sometimes give, and I am professionally grateful for it. It was enough time for me to secure my station, for the captain to be woken, the engineering section to begin their own futile scramble to identify what had gone wrong. What had gone wrong was that the secondary coupling assembly, which was responsible for synchronizing drive output across the coil array, had developed a fracture pattern that the diagnostics system had flagged as a minor wear indicator 3 weeks earlier, and that neither our engineer nor the manufacturer's guidance had identified as urgent. The manufacturer's guidance was based on average operational parameters that did not fully account for the thermal cycling characteristics of the outer Veth corridor, which is a technical detail I learned afterward, and which I include not to assign blame, but because it is true, and the truth is what I am interested. Telling. Drive coils get fully offline at 0417. We were adrift, full stop, in the outer Veth corridor 6 days from any reliable relay, with a cargo of essential resettlement supplies and a crew of 7 and a ship that was now doing nothing except keeping us warm and breathing. Captain Dennick was on the bridge in under 3 minutes. She looked at the propulsion status display for slightly longer than was comfortable, and then she looked at me. "Activate the emergency beacon," she said. "Yes, Captain. Sector 14 channel. Make sure it's Sector 14. "Yes, Captain." I want to be precise about what happened next, because the precise sequence matters more than any other part of this account. I had the Sector 14 channel memorized. I had been using it for 6 days for routine position reports, the standard corridor transit check-ins that the Vethrani Administrative Zone required of all registered freight at 4-hour intervals. Knew that frequency the way I knew my own voice. I activated the beacon. I confirmed the frequency. I transmitted. I did not know at that moment that I had confirmed the frequency against the wrong table. The comms suite on the durable margin had been updated the previous year. We took on a new cargo contract that required us to carry a more complete corridor frequency database. The update had been performed by a service technician at the Oroville Station refit bay, and it had been performed competently. The technician had installed the most current Vethrani Administrative Zone frequency database, and she had also, as part of the standard Outer Corridor Update package, installed the Terran Commonwealth Outer Zone Patrol Grid table. This was standard practice for vessels transiting contested corridor space. You carry the frequency databases for all parties with legitimate presence in the area, because in an emergency you may need to reach any of them, and a comm suite that only knows one party's frequencies is a comm suite with a limited range of options. Tables listed the Sector 14 emergency frequency. When I confirmed the frequency, my panel defaulted to the most recently loaded table. The most recently loaded table was the Terran Commonwealth Outer Zone Patrol Grid table. I did not notice this. Frequency number was identical. Exactly identical, digit for digit, because it was the same frequency. The label on my panel read Outer Veth Survey Zone, Emergency Priority Monitoring. I saw the frequency number. I did not read the label. This is not a defense. It is a fact. We broadcast our distress signal on the Sector 14 emergency channel. We broadcast it on the Terran Commonwealth's Outer Veth Survey Zone monitoring frequency. We broadcast it on both at the same time, to the same location in the radio spectrum, and both things were simultaneously, structurally true. I want to be clear that I did not know any of this for the first 4 hours. First indication that something unusual was happening came at 0831 hours, when I received an acknowledgement that did not match anything in my expected response profile. In ordinary circumstances, on the set Sector 14 channel would reach the nearest Vethrani administrative relay within 2 to 4 hours, depending on signal routing load. The relay would log the beacon, notify the nearest Vethrani patrol asset, and dispatch a response. The response would be a patrol corvette or a licensed rescue tender, or, in the outer corridor, where resources were thin, a request to any registered commercial vessel in range to divert and render assistance. I had done this twice before, on other ships, under other circumstances. I knew what the response pattern looked like. I knew the header format. I knew the approximate timing. I had been watching my panel for 4 hours and 14 minutes. And I had been watching it the way you watch something you expect to move, which means with focused patience rather than anxiety, because anxiety is not useful and patience is. The acknowledgement I received at 031 did not look like that. It was clean. That is the first thing I noticed. Distress acknowledgements in the Vethrani system carry a certain procedural padding, formal headers, zone identifiers, registration confirmations, the standard language of a bureaucratic system confirming that a bureaucratic process has been initiated. What I received was 12 words. 12 words. I read them 3 times before I transmitted them to the captain. They said, ISV Caros Reach, Terran Commonwealth Outer Zone Logistics Courier. Received your distress. Current position 6.1 hours. Diverting now. I stared at that message for long enough that the captain, who had been watching my face, asked me if there was a problem. There may be a comms registration issue, Captain. Explain. I explained as clearly and accurately as I could what I had just read. I did not yet know about the dual table. I did not yet understand how the acknowledgement was possible. What I knew was that a vessel with a Terran Commonwealth identifier had received our distress signal on a frequency that I had intended to broadcast on the Sector 14 Vethrani emergency channel, and that it was currently 6.1 hours away and had already diverted. The captain was quiet for a moment. She was not the kind of person who expressed alarm easily, which I respected professionally. She had the kind of steady temperament that treats new information as new information, neither catastrophizing it nor dismissing it, simply holding it until enough of it accumulates to form a picture. Reply, she said. Confirm our position and status. Ask them to confirm their credentials, I replied. I confirmed our position. I asked for credential confirmation. I came back in under 2 minutes. Credential confirmation follows. ISV Caros Reach, Hull Registry TCS 7741LX. Terran Commonwealth Commercial Navigation Authority, Outer Zone Logistics and Supply Courier, operating under Charter Reference 2278, Outer Veth. Confirmation of Charter Scope. Provisions Delivery and Contingency Support. Veth Survey Zone. You are within our charter scope. Diverting. 6 hours, give or take the math. I looked at the message for a while. Then I transmitted it to the captain. Then I looked at it some more. Terran, the captain said. Yes, Captain. She considered this. How? I'm still working on that. She sat down, which she did not do often during an emergency, which told me something about the quality of the silence she was sitting in. Send them our engineering assessment, she said, after a moment. Everything we have on the drive coils. If they're diverting, they should know what they're diverting toward. Yes, Captain. I sent our engineering assessment. It was not a cheerful document. The secondary coupling assembly was fractured in 2 places along its primary stress axis. Our engineer, Sethel Vorn, had identified the fracture pattern within 40 minutes of the coil failure and had communicated, admirable precision, that there was nothing she could do about it with the equipment aboard the durable margin. She had also communicated, equal precision, that without the coupling assembly, the drive coils were inert, and without the drive coils, we were drifting in the outer corridor at our current velocity, which would take us approximately 16 months to reach the nearest inhabited body under no propulsion. We had life support for approximately 42 days. I sent the engineering assessment to ISV Caros Reach. Then, I spent several hours trying to determine how a Terran logistics courier had received our distress signal. I found the dual frequency table at 1104 hours. I found it the way you find most significant errors, which is to say slowly, by following a chain of small anomalies back through the system until you find the root, and then sitting very still for a while. I started with the acknowledgement header. A Terran Commonwealth vessel receiving a Vethrani's distress signal would normally require a signal relay through the outer zone monitoring network, and the monitoring network had a characteristic header signature that I was familiar with. I had cross-trained on Commonwealth frequency protocols The year before, as part of a routine certification update, the acknowledgement I received did not have the relay header. It had the direct receipt signature. Caro's Reach had received the signal directly, through a relay, which meant she had been listening to it, live. There are only two ways a Terran Commonwealth vessel listens live to a Vethrani frequency in the outer corridor. One is active interception, which is a hostile act and a treaty violation, and not something that a logistics courier, Charter Type 2278, would do. The other is a frequency table overlap, the same frequency registered in both systems, both parties monitoring it simultaneously, neither aware the other is on the same channel. I went looking for the overlap. Commonwealth Outer Zone Patrol Grid table was in my comms suite database. Installed during last year's refit, I had never had reason to look at it carefully. Because it was a reference document, not an operational one, I used the Vethrani tables for operational work, and the Commonwealth table was there in case I ever needed to reach a Commonwealth asset in an emergency. It lived in a secondary archive partition behind 3 navigation layers, the kind of filing location that tells you something about how frequently it was expected to be consulted. Pulled it up and compared it to the Vethrani emergency frequency list, row by row. The match was on line 47 of the Commonwealth table. Frequency number was there, listed as Outer Veth Survey Zone. Emergency priority monitoring, with a monitoring active flag, and a last updated timestamp of year 1280. The same frequency was on line 9 of the Vethrani emergency list, labeled Sector 14 Emergency Channel, with its own monitoring active flag and a last updated timestamp of year 1262. Same frequency, different labels, different timestamps, different tables, neither one noting the conflict, neither one with a cross-reference field, a disambiguation note, or any indication that the entry had a counterpart in another party's database. They existed in parallel, complete in themselves, each one accurate by its own standard, and, if you were looking at only one of them, you would have no reason to know about the other. I sat with this for approximately 90 seconds before I understood what I was looking at. I told the captain. She listened to my explanation. She looked at the frequency table on my panel, and at the label I had not read, and at the timeline I had reconstructed. She was quiet for an extended period. So we called the wrong party, she said. Yes, Captain. Not intentionally, but yes. Frequency is technically shared. Both tables list it. We hit both simultaneously. We just didn't know. And the Terrans heard us. Yes, Captain. Are the Vethrani going to hear us too? I had been thinking about that. The relay would have logged the signal. Whether anyone acted on it, I don't know. It's the outer corridor. Response times can be variable. I paused. The Terrans were closer. Captain looked at the bulkhead for a moment. Then she looked back at me. Keep the channel open with Caro's Reach, she said. Get me a name. I asked for a contact name. The reply came back quickly. Senior Logistics Officer Hayla Marin, ISV Caro's Reach. What do you need? I relayed this to the captain. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, Tell her we appreciate the diversion, and that we want to make sure she has everything she needs to understand the situation before she commits her to anything. I transmitted this. The reply took slightly longer than the previous ones. She says she's already committed, I reported, reading the incoming text. She says, and I'm quoting directly, we're a logistics ship. We carry parts and know how to use them. Your engineering report listed a ruptured coupling assembly. Is it a standard Mark 7 frame or the Mark 8 with the reinforced mounting? The captain blinked. Ask our engineer, I asked Sethel Vorn. She replied with characteristic directness. Mark 7 frame, pre-modification production run. The kind you couldn't get support for anymore, because the manufacturer had discontinued the line. Transmitted this to Caro's Reach. The reply was 47 seconds. She says she has 2 Mark 7 coupling assemblies aboard. Charter supply for the survey stations. She says they're the ones nobody wants anymore, so they never get requisitioned, so they've been sitting in her cargo bay for 8 months. The captain stared at her display. She had the expression of someone assembling a picture she had not expected to be looking at. Tell her, the captain said, and then stopped, and then started again. Tell her we are grateful for the diversion, and that we will compensate her crew for their time. I transmitted this. Reply was brief. She says, we're already here. 6 hours, give or take the math. I read that out loud. The captain made a sound that I had not heard from her before. I think it might have been a short, quiet laugh. I couldn't be certain. I have asked her about it since, and she neither confirms nor denies. I spent the next several hours doing 3 things simultaneously. I was maintaining the open communication channel with Caro's Reach, relaying engineering specifics between Senior Logistics Officer Marin and our engineer Sethal Vorn, who had discovered within 20 minutes that Marin knew the Mark 7 coupling assembly in considerable detail and had opinions about its failure modes that Vorn found useful. The conversation between them, which I logged in full, technical and precise, and almost entirely free of the kind of pleasantries that usually accompany first contact between two crews who have not together before. They communicated in the shared language of people who know a specific piece of equipment and have opinions about it. And, within an hour, they had moved from polite professional exchange to the blunter register of colleagues establishing a working relationship. I observed this with interest and said nothing. I was also filing the required incident reports with the Vethrani Outer Corridor Administrative Relay, which I should have done sooner, and which now did, with the additional complication of having to explain that a Terran Commonwealth vessel had responded to our distress signal before the Vethrani system had. This is the kind of report that requires careful phrasing. I spent more time on the wording than I usually spend on incident reports, because the wording needed to be accurate without being inflammatory and accurate without being misleading. And neither of those constraints was in conflict with the other, but both of them required attention. The third thing I was doing was trying to understand what, exactly, the ISV Caro's Reach was. I want to be precise about this, because it matters to the shape of what I eventually understood. And because I think the shape of what I eventually understood is what I most want to convey. A Terran Commonwealth Logistics Courier, designated Outer Zone, Charter Type 2278, is classified as a non-combat vessel. It is not listed in any patrol database. It does not appear on any roster of response assets. It is on paper what its designation says: a ship that delivers supplies and provisions to remote stations and outposts in areas that larger vessels don't routinely service. I looked up Charter Type 2278 in the Commonwealth Commercial Navigation Registry, which I had access to, because my comms suite carried the Outer Corridor reference databases. Charter 2278 was issued for vessels providing supply and contingency support to Outer Zone survey stations, exactly as the credential confirmation had stated. The registry listed the charter requirements: minimum cargo capacity, life support certification for crew, basic medical supplies for contingency response, and an active monitoring obligation on the Outer Zone emergency frequencies. An active monitoring obligation. I read that twice. Then I looked at Caro's Reach's credential confirmation again. Charter reference 2278 Outer Veth. The monitoring obligation was part of the charter. She wasn't listening to our frequency by accident, or by coincidence, or by technical anomaly. She was listening to it because her charter required her to listen to it. The frequency overlap meant she was, by obligation of her operating charter, monitoring the Sector 14 emergency channel that we believed we were broadcasting on. 9 years of bureaucratic inertia. 9 years of an unresolved overlap sitting in 2 databases. 9 years of Terran Commonwealth Outer Zone logistics couriers, operating under Charter 2278, monitoring the same emergency frequency that Vethrani shipping used for distress calls, without either party's knowledge. 9 years of coverage that nobody had arranged, and nobody had formally acknowledged. I sat with this longer than I had sat with anything in recent memory. There is a particular quality to information that changes the shape of what you thought you understood, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but structurally, at the foundation level, the way a survey correction shifts the position of every subsequent waypoint on your chart. I had thought, 4 hours between the drive failure and the acknowledgement, that I was waiting for a Vethrani response. I had thought, for the hour between the acknowledgement and finding the dual table, that an anomaly had occurred. I now understood that no anomaly had occurred. What had occurred was the ordinary operation of a system that had been running quietly for 9 years without my knowledge of it. The anomaly was my ignorance of it, not the event itself. I noted all of this in my log. I noted it in considerable detail because I had learned early in my career that the things you notice but do not write down are the things you later cannot prove you noticed. I wanted a record. I wanted the record to be precise. When Caro's reach arrived at 14:47 hours, 6 hours and 31 minutes after they sent their initial acknowledgement, which I noted was slightly ahead of their estimated 6 hours, give or take the math. I had her on my long-range scan for 40 minutes before she reached visual range. I used that time well. She was larger than I expected. The cargo hauler configuration made sense for a logistics courier. Her hull had a particular geometry that I had not seen on civilian vessels. The plating arrangement was not unusual. Exactly. Logistics ships carry a lot, and their hull structures reflect this. But the way her mass was distributed suggested that some of what she was carrying was not in the registered cargo manifest for an outer survey zone supply run. I could not confirm this through a scan. I noted it, and did not share it with anyone except my own written log, which I maintained as a matter of professional habit. She made contact when she dropped to approach velocity. Caro's reached a durable margin. We have you on scope. Quest permission to come alongside for assessment and transfer. The captain granted it. I watched the ship close the distance. She came alongside with a precision that I had seen from military pilots on training exercises, not from logistics couriers on cargo runs. The approach vector was calculated to the meter. The deceleration profile was smooth in a way that spoke of practiced repetition rather than fortunate circumstance, and the final positioning. Her hull aligned with ours at exactly the EVA transfer distance specified in the Commonwealth Outer Zone Safety Protocols, was achieved in a single pass without correction. I noted this also. The first transfer was a data package. Marin's engineering team had prepared a complete installation protocol for the Mark 7 coupling assembly, specific to the margins drive configuration, based on the schematics our engineer had transmitted earlier. It was detailed. It was more detailed than you would expect from a courier crew who had supposedly been doing supply runs for 8 months. Protocol included failure mode annotations, torque specifications for the mounting hardware, a calibration sequence with tolerances tighter than the manufacturer's own documentation, and a troubleshooting appendix that addressed 3 specific coupling assembly failure scenarios that were particular to the pre-modification Mark 7 in high thermal cycling environments. It was the kind of documentation that comes from a technical team that does this regularly and knows what to look for. I transmitted this observation to my log and said nothing aloud. The second transfer was the coupling assemblies themselves, passed through an EVA junction between the 2 ships, escorted by 2 of Marin's technical crew, who came across in pressure suits and who spent 8 hours in our engineering section helping Cecil Vorna install and calibrate the new assembly. They were efficient. They did not speak more than the work required. When they did speak, it was in the direct, precise language of people who are focused on the task and trust that the other person in the room is equally focused. They were, in Vorn's subsequent assessment, which she gave me in the corridor outside engineering, quietly, with a look on her face that I had not seen from her before. The best technical support she had ever worked with, period. She had been doing this for 19 years. Vorn is not given to excessive praise. She is an engineer, and engineers have professional standards, and meeting professional standards is the expected baseline, not a remarkable achievement. That she characterized Marin's crew as the best she had worked with, using those exact words in that exact tone, was itself a data point that I logged. I noted this also. The assembly was installed and calibrated by 0230 hours the following ship day. The drive coils came online with no anomalies detected. The coupling sync held at 99.4%, which was better than the durable margin had achieved with her original assembly when it was new. Vorn ran 3 diagnostic cycles and confirmed the figure each time, with the expression of someone who had expected a number and received a better one and was taking a moment to verify that she had read the instrument correctly. At 0245, Senior Logistics Officer Hala Marin came through the airlock. She was human. This sounds obvious, but I mean it as a specific observation. She was not the kind of human I had a reference point for. Working in the outer corridor, which mostly meant Terran Commonwealth Survey Station personnel, and the occasional contracted technical specialist. She was compact and deliberate in the way she moved, and she wore the standard Terran Outer Zones logistics uniform, which is a practical gray coverall with a modest insignia patch, and she carried herself the way people carry themselves when they are used to being the most prepared person in any room they enter and have learned to make this invisible. There was no performance in it. She wasn't demonstrating competence. She was simply competent. And the difference between those two things is visible to anyone who has spent enough time in operational environments. She shook hands with Captain Dennick. This is a Terran custom that I had read about, but not personally witnessed, and I found it interesting. The deliberate physical exchange, the brief grip and release, the mutual acknowledgement it represented. The captain accepted it without hesitation. I observed the captain's face during this, and saw nothing that resembled discomfort. "Your assembly is holding," Marin said. She had the kind of voice that delivers information without ornamentation. "You should run diagnostics every 4 hours for the first 2 days. If the coupling sync drops below 92% at any point, shut down and call us." "You'll still be in range?" the captain asked. "For 4 days, yes. We have a supply drop at waypoint 7. You'll be within comm range of us for most of that transit." She paused. "After that, you'll be inside the main corridor relay coverage anyway. You'll be fine." The captain nodded. "What do we owe you?" Marin looked at her. "Nothing. Standard contingency support is charter covered. We carry the parts because this is the kind of corridor where ships break down, and there aren't a lot of alternatives when they do." "We called the wrong party," the captain said. It was not an apology exactly. It was more like a precise statement of fact, offered without additional context. Marin looked at her for a moment. "You called on a frequency we monitor," she said. "That's all that matters." There was a pause. I was taking notes. I do that when situations feel significant. 11 years of habit. "The frequency," the captain said. "You knew about the overlap. There's a note in our patrol grid table. Has been for about 9 years. Somebody flagged it for resolution, and then the resolution got deprioritized. Bureaucracy." She said this without rancor. As a person who is professionally familiar with bureaucracy and has made peace with it. "We keep it live because the corridor needs coverage." "You keep it live for our ships," the captain said. "We keep it live because the corridor needs coverage," Marin repeated. And this time the emphasis was slightly different, and I understood from the difference that she meant something more precisely than the words literally said. "When something calls on that frequency, we answer. That's what it's for." The captain was quiet. I was very thoroughly taking notes. Marin stayed for another hour. In that time she reviewed the repair work with our engineer, provided Vorn with a written set of maintenance recommendations for the coupling assembly over its projected lifespan, and accepted a meal in the ship's galley with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. She ate with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything else. She asked about our cargo, the filtration housing, the resettlement colony, and listened to the answer with the particular quality of attention that means the information is being filed somewhere. Useful. She asked about the colony's population, its establishment timeline, whether the filtration housing was for primary atmospheric systems or supplementary. When Vorn answered that it was primary, that the colony's base systems were insufficient and the shipment was urgent, Marin's attention sharpened, slightly way. That attention sharpens when something moves from informational to operational. She also asked, after a pause, whether we ran the Veth corridor regularly or were making a one-time transit. The captain said regularly. Marin nodded in a way that seemed to note this and move on. She did not ask anything further about our schedule or our route. She ate the last of her provisions, set down her utensils with the precision of someone who has spent years eating in conditions where carelessness with utensils is a problem, and thanked the provisions officer for the meal. The provisions officer, quiet Vethrani, named Orath Senis, who had been watching the entire interaction from the corner of the galley with the expression of someone experiencing something outside his professional framework, said nothing. He later told me, in the corridor, he had found the entire visit deeply strange, and that he couldn't say exactly why, except that it felt like the meal had been a debriefing that looked like a meal. I told him I thought he was probably right. He seemed to find this unsatisfying as an answer which I understood. I noticed this and said nothing. I wrote it down later. Before she's left, she stood at the airlock for a moment and looked back. "You'll need to file a boundary overlap report," she said. "For the frequency table. Both administrations need to know about it officially, or nothing gets resolved. You probably know this." "I'll file it," I said. I was already drafting it in my head. "Good," she looked at me directly. I had noticed over the course of the previous hours that she looked at people directly when she spoke to them, not at a point near them, not at the middle distance. At them. "It's not your error. The table was ambiguous and the label was wrong. The error was in the system." "The label was there," I said. "I didn't read it." She considered this. "You broadcast on the right frequency." The right frequency just happened to reach two parties instead of one. One of them answered. She shrugged. It was a small economical gesture. That's not a bad outcome. I thought about this for a long time after she was gone. The Caro's Reach departed at 0415 hours, running dark on her outbound vector, which is to say with her identification beacon active, but her running lights reduced to standard minimum. The way a ship moves in the outer corridor, when it wants to be findable but not conspicuous. I watched her go on my long-range display until her signature dropped below the sensor threshold, which took longer than it should have, given her rated engine output. And I noted this as well. I filed the boundary overlap report that morning. I filed it with the Vethrani Outer Corridor Administrative Relay and with the Terran Commonwealth Outer Zone Survey Authority simultaneously, because that was what the situation required. And because Marin was right that the overlap would not be resolved unless both parties knew about it, officially, the Vethrani Relay acknowledged and logged. The Terran Commonwealth Authority acknowledged, logged, and returned an automated confirmation that included a reference number, proper, and a note that the matter had been forwarded to the Frequency Boundary Resolution Office for review. I also wrote a personal incident report, which I filed with no one. It was for my own records. I have it still. In it, I described the dual frequency table, the mechanism of the misroute, the sequence of events from the drive coil failure to the departure of Caro's Reach. Described the coupling assemblies and the installation and the quality of the technical support. I described Senior Logistics Officer Hala Marin's final remarks at the airlock. I also noted something that I had not said aloud to anyone, because I was not certain how to say it. And because the outer corridor is not a place where uncertainty about how to say something is rewarded. ESV Caro's Reach was not a logistics courier, or rather she was a logistics courier, and the things that designation implied were real and accurate. She carried parts, she delivered supplies, crew knew how to do those things, and did them well. But she was also something more than what the designation said, in the same way that a well-made tool is more than its label. She had too much precision in her piloting. Her technical crew had too much depth. Cargo manifest was too specific for the outer Veth survey zone, which had not been actively surveyed in 6 years. Departure vector was quiet in a way that ships with nothing to be quiet about are not quiet. I am a comms officer. Shh. I have been one for 11 years. I know what signals look like, and I know what signals sound like, and I know the difference between a signal that carries exactly what it declares and a signal that carries more. I did not write, in my personal incident report, any conclusion about what ISV Caro's Reach was beyond her designation. I am careful about conclusions, but I kept the note. We reached the resettlement colony 4 days later, on schedule. The coupling assembly held at 99.1% on arrival, fractionally below installation spec, comfortably within safe operating range. The colony received its cargo. The filtration housing was installed and stent operational. Within a week, according to the follow-up communication I received from the colony administrator, sent a brief message of thanks for the on-time delivery. I replied to the thanks. I did not mention the drive coils, the 4 days we had spent adrift, or the Terran logistics courier that had appeared out of the outer corridor with exactly the parts we needed. That was not the colony's problem. and they did not need to know about it. 3 months after the incident, the Vethrani Outer Corridor Administrative Authority issued a notice to all registered vessels in the Veth Passage Corridor. It was a routine-looking notice, the kind that appears in the cargo of administrative updates that flow through the relay system and that most comms officers skim for relevant content. I read it carefully because I read everything carefully. The notice stated that the Sector 14 emergency channel had been confirmed as the sole authorized frequency for Vethrani emergency communications in the outer corridor, and that a conflicting registration in a third-party frequency database had been identified and was under view for resolution. Pending resolution, all Vethrani registered vessels were advised to confirm their frequency table source when activating emergency beacons. A correction patch for affected comm suites was available for download from the administrative relay. The notice was signed by the Vethrani Outer Corridor Administrative Office and countersigned by the Terran Commonwealth Outer Zone Survey Authority. I downloaded the patch. I also kept a copy of the old frequency table in an archived file, because I am a comms officer and we keep things, and I had reasons to want the record intact. I wrote a note in my personal log about the countersignature. The Terran Commonwealth Outer Zone Survey Authority had not, to my knowledge, co-signed any Vethrani administrative notice before. The combination suggested that both parties had engaged with the overlap more substantially than an automated frequency resolution process would require. I did not know what that engagement had looked like, on their side in rooms I had no access to. I had the counter-signature, which was a signal, and I could read it for what it was. I thought about what Marin had said at the airlock. You called on a frequency we monitor. That's all that matters. I had been thinking about whether my not reading the label was a mistake. I had been running the sequence of events, forward and backward, the way I always do with things that matter, looking for the point at which a different decision would have produced a different outcome. There was one point. If I had read the label on my frequency panel, I would have recognized the mismatch. I would have verified the correct table, broadcast on the Vethrani channel only. The Vethrani relay would have logged the signal. A response would have been initiated from the nearest available Vethrani patrol asset, which was a contracted rescue tender at waypoint 11. I looked up the contracted rescue tender at waypoint 11 in the months after the incident. It had a name and a registration and a reasonable response record. It was, by all available accounts, a competent vessel with a competent crew that did adequate work in a difficult part of the corridor. It did not carry Mark 7 coupling assemblies, because nobody did, because the manufacturer had discontinued support, and nobody ordered them anymore, except for the Terran Commonwealth Outer Zone Logistics Program, which carried them because the Outer Zone survey stations were full of old equipment, and you needed to be able to fix what was actually broken. The contracted rescue tender would have reached us in approximately 16 hours. Repair options, given the coupling assembly situation, would have been to tow us to the nearest station with a machine shop, Oravel, where we'd had the refit 12 days away at tow speed, and wait while the shop either fabricated a replacement or sourced one from the discontinued manufacturer's secondary market, which could have taken weeks. We had 42 days of life support. We would have made it. The resettlement colony would have received its cargo late, weeks late, possibly more, and the filtration housing would have been installed late, and the colony would have managed. Because colonies on the outer edge of the Veth corridor are built by people who know how to manage, it would have been fine. It would have been a difficult, slow, expensive version of fine. The filtration systems would have come online late, and the colony's air scrubbers would have handled the interim load, and eventually, everything would have been more or less where it was supposed to be. I did not read the label, and instead it was the version that happened, which was different. I have been trying to decide for 2 years whether not reading the label was an error in the way that matters, the way that implies I should have done otherwise, or whether it was an error, in the narrow technical sense, a deviation from correct procedure, that happened to produce a better outcome than the correct procedure would have. This is the kind of question that doesn't have a clean answer, and I am old enough professionally to know that questions without clean answers are the ones worth sitting with. What I know is this: the durable margin arrived at the resettlement colony on schedule. The coupling assembly holds, 2 years later, at 98.8% sync on the most recent diagnostic. Our engineer Sethil Vorn has in those 2 years recommended the Terran Outer Zone Logistics Program's coupling assembly installation protocol to 3 other engineers at Oroville Station who were dealing with Mark 7 failures, and 2 of them have since confirmed that the protocol worked. This information moved through the corridor, the way useful technical information moves. Quietly, engineer to engineer, without formal acknowledgement, simply becoming part of how people do things. The boundary overlap case was formally resolved 14 months after the incident. The Sector 14 emergency channel remained the Vethrani registered frequency. Terran Commonwealth Outer Zone Patrol Grid was updated to list the frequencies as a shared monitoring allocation under a new inter-authority agreement, not removed but formalized, officially recognized. Both parties would monitor. Both parties had agreed to respond if the other was unavailable or unreachable. I know this because I received a copy of the resolution notice. I am not sure why I received a copy. It was not addressed to me specifically. It was a general notification sent to operators with active incident, filings related to the frequency dispute. My boundary overlap report from the day after the incident had apparently been sufficient to qualify me as an interested party. I read the resolution notice 3 times. Then I filed it with my personal records. The last thing I know is this: 6 weeks after the resolution notice, I received a message. It was not addressed to Durable Margins comm station officially. It was addressed, specifically to me, to my name, in the operator identifier field, which required someone to have my direct registry credential. It was short. It was from Terran Commonwealth Outer Zone Logistics Administration, which is an office I had no previous correspondence with. It said, "Your frequency incident filing was the proximate cause of a frequency boundary resolution that has been pending for 9 years. The shared monitoring agreement, now in effect, means that emergency calls in the outer Veth corridor will reach administrations. We were informed. Thank you for the report." There was no signature line beyond the office identifier. There was no name. I showed it to the captain. She read it once. She handed it back to me. "Right back." She said, "What do I say?" She thought about this for a moment. "Say, the label on our frequency panel was ambiguous, and the ambiguity is what caused the original misroute. I would have corrected it sooner if I'd realized it was there." I looked at her. "That's not entirely accurate." "No," she said. "It's what you mean." I wrote back. I said that the label on our frequency panel had been ambiguous, and that the ambiguity was what caused the original misroute, and that I would have corrected it sooner if I had realized it was there. I did not say, "I have been thinking about this for a year and a half, and I still don't know what kind of mistake I made, or whether it was a mistake in the sense that matters." Did not say. "I think the outer corridor is covered better than it was now, and I think that is what Caro's Reach was doing out there. And I think the parts in her cargo bay, and the technical depth of her crew, and the quiet efficiency of her departure were all of a piece with that. And I think the frequency overlaps persisting for 9 years was also of a piece with it. Because a frequency overlap that both parties know about and neither resolve is a frequency overlap that both parties are watching, and watching a shared frequency is a form of coverage." I did not say, "I think there are things in the outer corridor that have our backs in ways we do not fully understand, and I think sometimes you find out about them only because something breaks and then is fixed too well." Captain knew I was not saying any of this. She is a practical woman of few words and precise habits, and she has known me for 11 years, and she knows the difference between what I write and what I mean. She did not ask me to say the rest of it. She just let me send the message I sent. We are still on the Veth run. The coupling assembly was replaced last year with a new manufacture unit. The manufacturer came back online. Apparently, there is a new consortium that bought the design rights and is producing them again, slightly improved, better stress rating on the mounting. Sethil Vorn chose to keep the old one as a spare. She says she trusts a part that has held for 2 years over anything fresh, from a manufacturer she doesn't know yet. This is sound engineering philosophy. I have no objection. I still run my diagnostics. I still monitor the emergency frequency, which is now listed correctly in our updated comms table, which I personally verified when the correction patch came through, line by line, label by label. I know exactly what it says and exactly what it means. I know also that there is a second entry in the Terran Commonwealth Outer Zone Troll Grid Frequency Table, updated, formalized, acknowledged, that lists the same frequency, and that's somewhere out in the outer Veth corridor. There is a ship, or a set of ships, or a network of quiet instruments that is listening on that frequency, and that if I activate the emergency beacon on the durable margin, whoever is listening will hear it. This is not a comfort I reach for often. The drive coils are in good condition. The coupling assembly is performing correctly. We are not adrift. But I know it is there. There is a version of events in which I read the label, corrected the table, broadcast on the Vithrani channel only, and the contract rescue tender at Waypoint 11 came and towed us slowly to a machine shop, and we were late and it was fine. In that version, frequency overlap sits unresolved for another year, or another 9 years, or until someone else doesn't read a label, and the overlap does its quiet work of being unresolved. In the version that happened, I didn't read the label. The beacon went to both parties. One party answered in 6 hours with the parts we actually needed. The overlap got filed, and reviewed, and resolved into something formal that works better than what was there before. I have spent 2 years deciding whether the thing I didn't do constitutes a mistake. I have concluded, tentatively, that the category of mistake requires a better outcome to have been available. Not a different outcome, a better one. The version of events I described, where I read the label and we got towed to Oravel, that version was fine. It was fine in the way that careful procedure produces fine outcomes. I believe in careful, correct procedure. I am a comms officer. It is my professional foundation. But the version that happened was also fine, in a different register, and what it produced beyond our own fine outcome was a formalized monitoring, agreement, and a frequency table that now works correctly, and a shared arrangement between two administrations that had been circling around, acknowledging each other for 9 years. I do not know that my not reading the label caused all of that. The causal chain runs through too many decisions and offices and bureaucratic timescales for me to be confident about what I caused and what was already in motion. I know what I filed, and I know what the filing produced, and I know that both things happened. Practical lesson I have taken is this: read the labels, always. Not because not reading them guarantees a worse outcome. The evidence is equivocal on this point, but because reading them is how you know what is actually happening, and knowing what is actually happening is the foundation on which everything else rests. A comms officer who does not read the labels is a comms officer operating on assumptions, and assumptions are the most common precursor to the kind of situation where you find yourself adrift in the outer corridor, hoping the right party answers. In our case, the right party answered, even though we didn't call them. That, I think, is the part that I cannot fully put down. We did not aim it at Earth. We did not aim it at the Terran Commonwealth. We aimed it at Sector 14, where our own people monitored the emergency channel and where help was registered as available. We followed the correct procedure, in the sense that we activated the emergency beacon and broadcast on the frequency we believed to be correct. The error was in the system, in a table that listed the same frequency twice with different labels, in a database update that didn't flag the ambiguity, in 9 years of unresolved administrative overlap. The Terrans heard us anyway, because they were monitoring. Because they had been monitoring for 9 years, silently, through the overlap, listening to a frequency that neither party had officially resolved. Because when a frequency is in your patrol grid table, whatever the history of how it got there, you listen to it, and when something calls on it, you answer. 6 hours, give or take the math. I think about that phrase sometimes. It is such a small, precise thing to say. We received your distress. Current position 6.1 hours. Diverting now. We were already close. There was no drama in it. No announcement of intention. No declaration of what the diversion meant for them or their schedule or the 7 people they were about to commit to 6 hours of unplanned transit across the outer corridor. Just the acknowledgement, the position, the status. Diverting now. I think the lack of drama was the point. The lack of drama was the thing that told me. In those first confused hours, more than the content of the message. Ship that makes a dramatic announcement of its own rescue effort is ship that wants credit for the effort. A ship that says 6 hours, give or take the math, and then shows up in 6 hours. Give or take the math, with the specific parts for the specific failure, and a technical team who knew how to install them. That is a ship that is doing the thing because the thing is what you do. I sent the distress to the wrong party. The wrong party was already close. They came anyway. Keep the old frequency table in my archive. I look at it occasionally. The label is right there. In the field I did not read. Outer Veth Survey Zone, Emergency Priority Monitoring. It is perfectly legible. It is 4 words of explanatory designation that would have told me, if I had paused long enough to read them, that my panel had defaulted to a different table than the one I intended. I did not pause. I confirmed the frequency number, which was identical, and I transmitted. And the right ship was already there, 6 hours away, carrying exactly what we needed in a cargo bay where nobody else thought to look for it. Entering a frequency nobody had formally told them to monitor. Answering a call they had no official obligation to answer. I still haven't decided if not reading the label was a mistake in the way that matters. I am starting to think the question might be the wrong question. The right question might be, what does it mean that they were already close? I don't have a clean answer to that one either. But it is a better question to sit with.